Thank you for listening to Soho Bites, the only podcast in the world, as far as we're aware, dedicated to talking about films set in Soho, the beating heart of bohemian cosmopolitan London. If you would like to support the show, you can do this in the form of a star rating or review at sohobitespodcast.com/review, or if you'd like to put a small amount of money where your mouth is, you can do that at sohobitespodcast.com/donate. Donations can be from as little as £3, which will buy, at London prices, about half a drink for one of our thirsty guests. You may hear some different URLs in the upcoming episode, but by far the easiest way is to follow one of those links. They are again sohobitespodcast.com/review and sohobitespodcast.com/donate. Thank you for your continued support and enjoy the episode. Hello and welcome to episode 29 of Soho Bites. Soho Bites is the podcast in which we talk to people who love Soho and people who love film. My name is Dominic Delaghi, and to the millions of people out there who have kindly informed me about the new film that's coming out this month about Soho, in fact the word Soho is even in the title, I'm now fully aware of it. Thank you. It's actually a little bit too recent to feature on the podcast just yet, specialising as we do in films that have been out for some time. I will, though, get somebody on to talk about Last Night in Soho in about 27 years' time. So, good. I'm looking forward to that. I have yet to see Last Night in Soho, and I'm so looking forward to it. But all the indications are that it will be a lot more successful than the Soho film we're talking about in the second half of this month's episode. The notorious flop that bankrupted Goldcrest Studios, Absolute Beginners from 1986. The film was a loss-making disaster at the box office, as well as being a critical failure, as everybody knows. But was this reception for the critics and the public deserved? My guest for the film chat section of the show, a bit later on, is Del Pike, who in 2016 wrote an article entitled Absolute Beginners at 30, Was It Really So Bad? Ooh, controversial. He'll be making the case for Absolute Beginners in the second half of the show, and before that, Aiden McManus makes a return visit to Soho Bites to talk about the early Soho-centric career of one of the stars of Absolute Beginners, Patsy Kensit. Oh, I'm just joking. He will, of course, be talking about David Bowie, who, before he was famous, was a well-known face in Soho in the 1960s, trying out different bands and different images before finally hitting upon the winning formula that transformed him into a worldwide megastar. All of that after this. Oh, I do like a bit of bassoon. Or is it an oboe? Anyway, bassoon or oboe, this is definitely David Bowie, or Bowie, with his 1967 single The Laughing Gnome, in which young David is followed down the street by a helium-voiced gnome with a penchant for puns.
I was walking down the high street when I heard footsteps behind me, and there was a little old man, scarlet and grey, chuckling away.
It was not a huge success. In fact, it failed to chart when it was first released in 1967. As we know, though, this was not David Bowie's last attempt to break the charts, and neither was it his first, as he'd been around on the Soho music scene in different guises for several years by this point. Performing under his real name, David or Davy Jones, he'd been in several bands such as the Manish Boys and the Lower Third, and had performed and recorded in a variety of music styles, searching for that elusive something. When Bowie finally made it big, really big, with his Ziggy Stardust album and Persona, the famous album cover was shot just outside Soho, on the other side of Regent Street, perhaps signifying that his struggling Soho days were behind him. One man who knows all about Bowie's early years is Aiden McManus. Aiden is a London polymath who, as well as presenting a show on Portobello Radio, runs several walking tours, one of which is a David Bowie-themed tour of Soho. We met up in person, which is still a novelty, outside the Ship pub on Wardour Street because, as I found out, it's a significant location in the early life of David Bowie. Because, as you know, Soho Bites is the podcast that likes to ask the big questions, I started with the biggest question of them all. We're now recording. So, Bowie.
Yeah. I used to call him Bowie when I was a kid, but I got browbeaten into calling him Bowie.
Exactly the same thing, yeah.
So, I think if it's a bow and arrow, it's Bow. So, and I used to call him Bowie to annoy all the serious Bowie heads. And they go, it's not Bowie, it's Bowie. You know, all that. You're all right, mate. I'm sorry, yeah, all right, Bowie. Yeah, no, Bowie. But it really used to get to them. Like it was, you were mispronouncing their own name. Do you know what I mean?
Well, we're going to call him Bowie for the purposes of this interview.
Yeah.
So, welcome back on Soho Bites, Aiden. It's nice to see you again. Yes. We're outside the Ship pub on Wardour Street.
Ship, Bowie's old pub.
Bowie's old pub.
So you started me off now.
Sorry.
See? Right,
so why are we here? We can't go inside because it's too noisy. So why are we here, of all places?
This was the musicians' pub in Soho. So you've got Trident Studios at the back where Bowie did Space Oddity, Man Who Sold the World, Hunky Dory, Ziggy Stardust. So, you know, that early era, you know, just where he was sort of, everyone thought he was a one-hit wonder after Space Oddity, and then he had, well, even Hunky Dory, when it came out, didn't set the world on fire. If you look at Hunky Dory, he's got long hair on the cover, and on the back he's got long hair and big flares on. He looks like an old hippie.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean?
Was that an old picture that...
No, that's what he looked like when it was recorded. And then all of a sudden, the Ziggy thing, I think he started Ziggy Stardust within months, if not sooner. They just kept recording because he had so much stuff. So they chucked that album out and then started straight away on Ziggy. And then he met that Freddie Beretti who designed all those mad Ziggy outfits. And that's when it all changed. And when Ziggy came out, and then, of course, Starman, where he put his arm around Mick Ronson and scandalised the nation. Yeah. Two men with arms around each other. My God.
So, you think of David Bowie.
Yeah.
And obviously he's a London guy, born in Brixton. But you do think of Berlin, you think of New York. You run a Bowie-themed Soho tour. So... Yeah. How much history is there of Bowie in Soho?
At least 10 years before he was famous.
Before he was famous,
Going
that's
back
the thing,
to
isn't
the
it?
50s. He had a half-brother that was a lot older than him, who ended up in a mental hospital, this guy Terry. He was a beatnik, and he was into jazz. He was into all the beat poets and stuff. And so the beatniks all used the coffee bar, Heaven and Hell, and all these places. And he brought him here when he was a kid, just wandering around Soho and, you know, introduced him to Soho. Rock and roll turned up and, you know, he was a teenager in the 50s and so he went to the Two Eyes.
So Bowie went to the Two Eyes? I didn't know that connection.
I'm pretty sure he did. Maybe not in 1955
because
he was 8 or whatever, but the Two Eyes carried on into the early 60s.
Yeah, right.
And it was sort of a pilgrimage. So, you know what I mean? It was that sort of scene and that's where he got going. And then sort of 63, 64, he starts hanging around here sort of full time. He got a job, the only proper job I think he ever had was in an advertising agency around here. And his boss used to send him to Doe Bells to pick up records. And his boss was a bit of a hep music collector. So he used to spend an hour in there and he'd listen to all this stuff because his boss was sending him in there. And he was in these little R&B bands like the Manish Boys and...
Yeah, tell me about these little bands. I'm a bit confused about the Manish Boys and the Lower Third.
The Lower Third, yeah. Lower Third were from Margate. They were sitting in the Gioconda and he walked by and he had really long blonde hair and they thought he was Keith Relf.
Right.
Do you know what I mean? And so then they had an audition in La Discotheque, which is now a Chinese restaurant further down Wardour Street from where we are. But he was pretty good. He looked the part. And he could sing. They were doing Yardbirds covers, and so they said, "Yeah, you're all right. You'll do." And so that was probably his first sort of proper band. He was in a band called the King Bees with George Underwood, Davy Jones, and the King Bees or something. They used to play in the Roundhouse, which is on the corner of Brewer Street. I can't remember what it's called this week. It still has Roundhouse above the door. You see the one with the two lights?
Yeah.
Yeah, that used to be the Roundhouse. That first floor room in there was Alexis Corner's R&B club where Muddy Waters and everyone played up there, man.
That's amazing.
Muddy Waters probably had a drink in here. I know he had a drink in the Coach and Horses in Poland Street. So they've all been in all of these places. So, the King Davy Jones and the King Bees with George Underwood from school. He's the one that punched him in the eye and made his eyes go two different colours.
There's so many myths around him. I thought the punch in the eye thing was what made one of his pupils permanently dilated.
Yeah.
But the colour thing I thought was from birth.
No, that's from that punching in the eye.
Oh,
apparently.
really?
Yeah. Over a girl back when they was at school. But they made up, and he designed a few album covers, I think, for Bowie as well later on.
Highlighting his different coloured eyes.
Yeah. But that was always part of his look as well, having two different colour eyes, that sort of alien look.
Yeah.
And when he was doing Ziggy, it was perfect, having that.
Trident Studios is the back of where we are now.
Yeah.
Legendary studios. And it was partly... He wasn't the first artist to work there, was he?
No.
People like the Stones had been there. And stuff,
The
the
Beatles, I
and
think the Beatles put it on the map a bit because they did quite a lot of the White Album there, because it had 8 tracks and Abbey Road only had 4.
Yeah, what I heard was, Abbey Road used to shop at like 6 p.m.
Yeah, but I think they were probably still wearing lab coats up there in the 60s.
It was all that stuff,
do you know what I mean? Yeah.
So when Bowie went there, was it a bit of kudos to record there?
No, I don't know, man. He met Tony Visconti, and he was in a band with him called The Hype, and he was in another band just when he met him called Feathers with John Hutchinson. And that Hermione, the first woman who broke his heart, the dancer.
I don't know about it.
They were together in 67, 68, and she went off to make a musical called Song of Norway and left him here and broke his heart.
Oh, poor Davey.
But they were in some sort of acoustic hippie nonsense band. Another phase that he went through. He went from Anthony Newley. I think he was quite happy. He would have gone into musical theatre. I think he would have done anything.
Yeah, the Anthony Newley thing, that was the Laughing Gnome, wasn't it? That was Anthony Newley inspired.
Yeah. But that whole album, his voice is completely Anthony Newley inspired. It came out on the same day as Sgt. Pepper, so you're getting this sort of psychedelic stuff. Plus you're getting this Victoriana. And he was writing songs that some of them could have been music hall songs.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, like the Rubber Band, about some band during the First World War playing in a bandstand in the park. It's all a bit strange, but he did it all himself. And him and this guy called Dec Fearnley, who just worked out the orchestrations themselves, and they were giving it to these, seasoned session woodwind players and say, play this, and they're all sitting there smoking going, you sure? You want me to play this? And all this sort of stuff. So it's pretty ballsy, man. He didn't know what he was doing.
And what age is he at this stage? He's like
21.
Yeah, I mean, it's impressive.
The thing is, what characterises his Soho years, whenever it went wrong, he didn't get dispirited, he just did something else.
So all this chopping and changing and trying new things, that's the Soho years, basically. It's kind of, you could bring an album out of a retro album, call it the Soho years.
Well, yeah, but you've got sort of...
Boho. Soho, Soho years.
Sobo.
The
Sobo
Soho
years.
Bowie, yo.
The Boso.
I will work on that.
Yeah. We can re-record that bit.
That stuff from that period is quite run-of-the-mill and not, you can't particularly distinguish it from other stuff around at the time.
Yeah.
It's only retrospectively you go...
As soon as you hear his voice, you know it's him, but it's only because...
So it gives it a certain way.
Yeah.
So is it true to say that his encounter with Lindsay Kemp is what kind of turned him into more of a performance artist and a bit more of an original?
Well, I think, this pub has got something to do, because apparently when the first album bombed, he comes in here and he says, that's it, I'm finished with the music biz. I'm going to become a Buddhist monk in Scotland, and everyone laughed at him. But then that When I Lived My Dream, off that first album, Lindsay Kemp heard this album and liked it. To be honest with you, he probably liked the photo on the front.
This is the 1967, when he changed his name, he'd gone from Jones to Bowie at this
because
stage.
of the monkeys. And, I think Lindsay Kemp saw the picture and went, ooh, he's nice. And then listened to it and liked it. I like that album as well. And he started using When I Lived My Dream in this show he was doing. So he was one of these... Let me talk to you through the medium of dance and all that.
So he was established as an artiste
as a Ponzi dancer, right? Which that's what I'd call him. You know what I mean?
I'd call him worse than that. Having worked with him, man.
Yeah, you got to tell me that story. So Lindsay Kemp found out who his manager was and invited him to a performance of this play he was doing, which I can't remember the name of. So Bowie turns up with Hermione, and he's very flattered. And Lindsay comes, what a great song, David, and all this. And Lindsay Kemp lived in Bateman Street. He invited him back. She said, come back to my place. And apparently Kemp's flat was the Soho equivalent of Warhol's factory.
Okay.
Right, so there's all these trannies, hookers, pickpockets, you know what I mean, criminals, junkies, You know, he's a kid. He's like 20, 21. And you'd think he'd be a bit phased by all this sort of hardcore Soho action, but he wasn't at all. He was just soaking it all in. Yeah, but so apparently him and Kemp were lovers. He was very coy, I think, on whether that happened or not, but Lindsay Kemp was adamant that they were having a torrid love affair, and then they wrote a show together, Pierrot and Turquoise.
Oh, yeah.
They went on tour with it, and Lindsay caught Bowie with the wardrobe mistress in flagrante. And so they fell out, and then I think he went back to Hermione, who then went off to do Song of Norway.
Space Oddity was after that, wasn't it? It started to go a little bit kind of avant-garde.
Yeah, but I know, you know who I think is responsible for that, who never gets much of a shout, typically because she was a woman, is Angie Bowie. Or Bowie.
Bowie. Oh.
No, but she turns up, and she was the one pushing him to, you know, go for it. I mean, she was pretty wild.
So when did she come on the scene?
Oh, 69, 68,
okay, I thought she'd
69. No,
right, okay.
69, 70.
Okay.
And she turns up, and she starts really pushing him. She was the one that got him to wear the man dresses, and they moved into that Haddon Hall place down in Bromley. But they were still working in Soho. They were still recording in Trident all the time. The Spiders, apparently they had this revolving door full of people that they were both sleeping with. And I mean, it's pretty sort of Christopher Isherwood decadence. And this is where he started writing all this stuff that made him famous. Thing is with Bowie as well, he appealed to people right across the board. I mean, football hooligans, gay geezers, teeny bopper girls, older women, you know what I mean? The whole, right across the board.
Which is a bit Soho.
Yeah, exactly. And that's why, because he's been here for 10 years. This is like his Petri dish. I think he played the Marquee, 6 different bands. And getting gigs in the Marquee was quite a big thing. It meant you were getting somewhere. I mean, it was better than the Two Eyes.
Yeah, so basically the Marquee, it's because it's still a small venue, wasn't it? So, but you're on the way up, you're being noticed kind of thing. That was the status of it.
And it had a name.
Yeah.
And, you know, bands like the Yardbirds were playing in there, and, you know, The Who, and, you know, a bit later on. He probably played in there before The Who, I don't know, about the same time anyway. So he was well known in Soho, but he just couldn't buy a hit. Just wasn't happening, but never got discouraged.
So if people wanted to receive a personal tour of Soho by Aiden McManus,
yes,
a Bowie themed
Bowie
tour.
themed tour. Well, it is the
What do
Bowie
they do?
Soho.
Where do they
It's
go?
called FlipsideLondonTours.com.
FlipsideLondonTours.com.
Yeah, and it's I mean, I can do private ones as well, but it's called Bowie Soho. And basically, he started Denmark Street, which is where he went as a kid. He starts there, and his sort of last thing that he does in Soho, really, is the rap party for the Ziggy tour was in the Café Royal, which is on the west side of Soho. So he works his way across. Took him 10 years to work his way across. You're doing Absolute Beginners. That was a bit strange because, you know, he was around here about that time that it's set in, which is sort of late 50s.
Yeah.
So it's 1958, isn't it, Absolute Beginners? So sort of 12, 13. So he would have been up here with his brother. That film is awful. I mean, he's not a great actor.
No, he's not, no.
But, you know, God bless him. He's responsible for some of the greatest cultural moments of my life, and I'll always love him.
God bless him indeed, and God bless you, Aiden McManus, for coming on Soho Bites again. As Aiden mentioned there, the place to find him online is FlipsideLondonTours.com, where you can book for his Bowie tour, his Gangland Soho tour, and several others. He also has a regular show on Portobello Radio, which I would highly recommend. All of these details can be found, of course, in the show notes at SohoBitesPodcast.com. Hello, this is what's known as a mid-roll ad. It's one of those annoying interruptions that's inserted retrospectively at just the wrong point. And the reason for it is that Soho Bites takes up hours of time every month, and I'm hoping you might be able to support the show. There are 2 ways you can do this. One is for free, and it's to leave the show a star rating or kind review. You can do that at sohoBitesPodcast.com/review. Or if you'd like to assist financially to help cover our costs, you can do that at sohoBitesPodcast.com/donate. Thank you very much. Apologies for the interruption, and back to the episode. The last thing I'd ever want to do on this podcast is to talk about a film in entirely negative terms, but 1986's Absolute Beginners is famous above all for being a huge box office and critical failure. Based on Colin McInnes's 1959 novel of the same name, it was the big-budget baby of director Julian Temple, who'd long had the ambition to bring the book to the screen. He'd previously cut his teeth on music videos and rockumentaries, if you will, and he brought a flashy, very 1980s sensibility and aesthetic to this very 1950s novel.
I remember that hot, wonderful summer when the teenage miracle reached full bloom and everyone in England stopped what they were doing to stare at what had happened. The Soho nights were cool in the heat, with light and music in the streets, and we couldn't believe that this was really coming to us at last. Nobody knew exactly why, but after so many dreary years of bombs and blitz and slow rebuilding, no sugar, no jam, nothing sweet anywhere, with the whole English world dressed in grey, it seemed forever. Suddenly, life broke out in warm colours again, so young and beautiful that a lot of people couldn't stand to look at it. For the first time ever, kids were teenagers. We had loot, however come by, and loot's for spending. But where there's loot, trouble follows.
In the original story, the unnamed narrator is a 19-year-old jazz-loving photographer who lives in a rundown area of West London that he calls Napoli. You can take this to be Notting Hill, and spends his nights in Soho. In both these areas, he is at the centre of a broiling melting pot where all behaviours, races, genders and sexualities are embraced. Just don't be a taxpayer. That's youth speak for adults.
Right, indicate me that's for two of you, right?
This groovy scene is populated by a cast of characters who, like the narrator himself, are often nameless but have elaborate extended nicknames such as the Fabulous Hoplite, Call Me Cobber and the ex-Deb of last year. The narrator moves from scene to scene conversing with different members of the cast in a heightened stylised slang, and the effect of all this is that McInnes has created a theatrical, almost surreal world. It's this slightly fantastical edge to the book that I think Julian Temple has attempted to capture in his film. The opening set piece of Absolute Beginners is an exhilarating balletic tour around the huge, impressive Soho set. We see familiar locations such as Bar Italia and the Two Eyes, but there's no pretence that these are real Soho streets. It's clearly a show, and it appears to be done in one long Steadicam shot. Our nameless protagonist has been given the name Colin in a nod to the book's author, and is played by the absolute beginner Eddie O'Connell, appearing in his first film. His love interest, Crêpe Suzette, is played by 16-year-old Patsy Kensit, and is portrayed as much more innocent and chaste than the corresponding character in the book. Despite the film mostly being sold on the involvement of David Bowie, who plays the relatively small part of advertising executive Vendice Partners, the responsibility for carrying the film falls mainly on the young shoulders of the two leads, and unfortunately, they're not up to the job. O'Connell struggles with some of the trickier dialogue, and his outbursts of youthful anger never really convince. Kensit is drippy and lacking charisma, which makes it difficult to believe Colin's powerful obsession with her. They do both look good though, and look good together, which is symptomatic of the film's major problem in terms of its relationship to the book. It shies away from the more profound elements of the book, such as the touching relationship between the narrator and his father, and concentrates instead on surface glitz and glamour. We're in classic style over substance territory here, and it's all very 1980s.
True. Sometimes a knife came out. But that was always between friends. You behave yourself, you're all right here. It's not in Soho where some sex maniac leaps on your back and violates you. It's strictly for the respectable neighbourhoods.
Right then, come on, I've got half an hour.
The casting is another example of this. Contemporary, eye-catching pop culture icons are chucked in there with no real regard as to whether or not they can act, or if they're right for the part, and often they can't, and they're not. I really don't want to diss the film too much, as I think that's been done adequately by many others over the last 35 years, and there are genuinely impressive moments in Absolute Beginners. The musical numbers and the large set pieces with hordes of extras, who'd apparently been drafted in from the WAG Club, provide short bursts of enjoyment and there were clearly creatives and technical people involved who knew what they were doing. But as a whole, Absolute Beginners amounts to much less than the sum of its parts. It was always going to be difficult to adapt a tricky book like Absolute Beginners for the screen, and fans of the book are still waiting for a decent adaptation, which is the point made by my guest, Del Pike, in his 2016 article which asks, "Was Absolute Beginners really so bad?" Del is a freelance writer specialising in music, film, media and the arts, and has written for various publications and websites, including Get Into This, which is where I stumbled upon the Absolute Beginners article, Coney's Loft and Bido Lito magazine. He's also the course leader for moving image production at the Hugh Baird University in Liverpool. I should warn you that Del is a Scouser and I'm a Mancunian, but we managed to keep it civil when we spoke online about Absolute Beginners, a film for which he has a lingering soft spot. Del, help me out. I've been watching Absolute Beginners again. I watched it when it first came out, and I've watched it twice recently in preparation for this conversation. And largely, I am in agreement with the critics who didn't like it much. I feel like there is something in there that's worthwhile, but then I saw your article, which is entitled, "Was It Really That Bad?" So you must be a massive fan of this film. Although, let me just read a quote here before I release you with all your defences. This is a quote from the 1990 memoir of Jake Eberts, who ran Goldcrest Films. Goldcrest Films is the company that basically crashed because of Absolute Beginners.
Yeah.
He said that the only good thing about the film was Bowie's title track, Absolute Beginners, and he said, quote, "There was nothing in the picture to which you could attach hope. The music, the performances, the characters and the dance numbers added up to one of the least attractive films of the decade." So
Wow.
what say you?
That's damning, isn't it?
It is quite damning.
To say the least. I suppose he has a lot more at stake than me. I paid possibly about £5 for a cinema ticket.
Exactly, yeah.
I mean, I guess if you're attached to it and it bombs and it ruins your life for a while, you're going to be negative, aren't you?
But
in defence
convince
of
me.
the film, it's a tough one, I think, and it's one of those. I recently introduced it to my daughter when she watched it when she was about 16, and she loved it. She really liked Patsy Kensett's character, and she likes the music and such. But I think to truly appreciate it, you had to be there at the time and know what was going on in Britain at the time, and kind of have some understanding of why it was made, I think. So at that time, when it came out, I was 19 when I saw it. And I think I was just in the middle of all that. It was Thatcher's Britain, wasn't it? It was indie music versus the very sort of colourful Duran Duran Wham kind of music. There was a lot of opposites and a lot of conflict. And I guess it was just a breath of fresh air in some ways for me. I think it was something different, you know?
Yeah. I mean, I think if I get started on slagging it off, I could go on for quite some time.
Yeah.
But for me, there are positives in the film, such as production value-wise, it's very impressive. Fantastic sets.
Yeah.
The opening sequence with the Steadicam roving through Soho is very impressive. Some of the acting is quite good. Stephen Burkoff
Yes.
does a good performance. Irene Handel.
He is good. Mm-hmm.
They're very small parts, but both of them are very good.
Yeah, she's very good, yeah.
I struggle after that, though, I'm trying to be charitable. It feels shambolic and like the initial vision was not clear enough, other than music videos, which is what Julian Temple...
Yes.
That's his background, isn't it?
That was his stock in trade, wasn't it? Absolutely. I mean, he obviously had a lot of respect for Bowie and was a fan and a friend, I guess. So we were talking before about Jazzin' for Blue Jean, which was the extended music video he did for Blue Jean a couple of years prior to Absolute Beginners. And the colour schemes in that are very similar. You know, the neon blues and the pinks and the kind of garishness is all there, you know. And I almost feel like that was a test run for Absolute Beginners, you know, making him a very sort of 80s icon, really, I guess. The message is lost, though, isn't it?
It's a very 80s film, isn't it?
It's a very 80s film about the 60s. Well, about the 50s, I should say. 1958 it's set, isn't it? So how is that ever going to work? That's the thing, isn't it? You know, how are you going to make a very 80s film about the late 50s?
Yeah, I almost feel like it would have benefited more from being almost like a stage show, a series of musical numbers based on the book. It feels like that's what it almost is.
Yes.
But they've linked it together with these quite bad performances. Should we talk about the acting?
Yeah, go on.
It's not great, is it?
It's not great, is it? It's not great at all. And I know Bowie's perform. Obviously, he was the major pull of the film, wasn't he? Bowie was the major pull of the film. So you're kind of expecting him to impress, and he doesn't. Of course, he does music-wise. The title, the theme, the song "Absolute Beginners" is a belter, and and so is the big musical number in the middle. That's Motivation, but his acting's quite shocking. But is it intentional? This is the thing: is he intentionally bad?
Yeah, there is a moment when him and Colin are looking at the White City development.
Yeah,
and he drops out his American accent. He does this thing where he says, I can't remember what he says now, something like, "No, it's not, son."
Yeah,
goes into Cockney. It's horrible, yeah. And then goes back into his sort of fake American thing.
And that bit's quite cool, isn't it? I like that. And they even have it in a little flashback later on. So that's where you think, yeah, he's playing with us, isn't he? He's doing this on purpose. He's being bad on purpose, surely. Because we'd seen him, hadn't we? We'd seen him a couple of years earlier in Merry Christmas, Mr. Lawrence, where personally, I love that film. And personally, I think he's great in that.
Yeah, he's very good in that film, yeah.
So we know he can act. And The Man Who Fell to Earth and just about everything else, Labyrinth included, He's a good actor. I mean, he is, people have criticised him, but personally, I think he's always going to be a little bit affected. I mean, but in Absolute Beginners, he's playing a kind of like a stock character, isn't he? He's playing a part that, aside from the musical bits, would probably be played by a much straighter actor.
Yeah.
He asked, didn't he? He asked specifically to play that part.
Yeah, because I think Julian Temple approached him to make some music for the film, and he asked to be in it, and that's the part that he chose. Personally, although I think Stephen Burkoff was amazing in that part as the fanatic, they call him, don't they?
Yeah.
The Mosley character. I think Bowie could have done quite a good job at that as well.
I wonder, though, if there's a reason behind that, because he was accused, wasn't he, of having sort of Nazi tendencies a few years prior to that, do you remember?
Bowie was?
Yeah. Was he doing sort of like Nazi salutes from the back of a car or something?
Was it during his drug period? He did something that was,
I believe so,
bang out of order, yeah.
Yeah, I think he was a bit spaced out and didn't quite know what he was doing, but sort of lived to regret it for quite a long time, I think. So I wonder if, he didn't want to go down that path again, maybe.
Possibly. The Diamond Dogs tour, I can't remember who designed that tour, but he based it on Nuremberg rallies.
Right.
These, big banners and all, and sort of intimidating architecture and that kind of thing.
Uh-huh.
So, yeah, maybe he's touched on the Nazi thing too frequently.
A little too much.
Not that anybody seriously believes that David Bowie was a racist, but maybe he was. No. Maybe that part just appealed to him. Vendi's partners. Do you know much about how the film came into being?
From what I can gather, there's not a great deal spoken about the genesis of it as such. It's more about kind of the production, the post-production. From what I can gather, I think the main basis of it, he wanted to do a version of the book and gave a lot of pre-publicity as to what that was going to be like, with a few kind of mistruths, I think. He was presenting information to like The Face magazine at the time and NME, really bigging it up as being something much more than it actually ended up being, to try and generate as much publicity before the film was even made. So he's kind of setting himself up for a fail, really, I think.
Yeah.
Not being completely honest with the public. So I think, in terms of the genesis of it, I don't think anybody really knew what to expect. I think it was only when it came out, and it flopped immediately, didn't it? That was the thing.
It was immediate, yeah.
The opening night, it bombed. I remember the Tube did it. I was avidly watching the Tube around that time. And they did a show where they dressed the studio up like Soho.
That's right, yeah.
And it was very kind of Absolute Beginners themed, which raised a lot of, I guess, a lot of excitement. But you had something like the Tube, which was, incredibly cool,
Yeah.
But then the film didn't even really match the feel of the Tube, Some of the actors in it are so kind of from the old guard, aren't they? You've got people like Alan Freeman and Lionel Blair and people like that. You think this is meant to be a really cool youth film, and you've got these kind of creaky old actors in, creaky old sort of TV personalities.
I think they could have been quite good had the rest of the film around them been stronger, and they could have been like sort of cheesy interludes,
Yes. Lionel Blair actually features quite heavily, doesn't he?
Yeah, he's got quite a significant character, isn't he?
And in fairness, he actually plays it quite well, in fairness, doesn't he?
Yeah, I think he's quite good, isn't he? Yeah. I think it just falls down so badly. I think fundamentally, the biggest problem is this poor guy, Eddie O'Connell, who plays Colin. I say poor guy because he wasn't good enough to carry the lead of a film like that, a big film like that. He's inexperienced, and that shows, and I don't think it was fair of them to give him that part.
Yeah.
What a damaging experience for a young guy like that to be so badly slated, you know. It was his first film. It's a massive production. I mean, who gave him the job? Did Julian Temple sign off on that? He must have done.
Not sure. Don't know how he got chosen. It's more obvious why they chose Patsy Kensit, isn't it?
Yeah.
Kind of up-and-coming star, wasn't she?
And she's not great in it.
She's not great. I like the bit with, I like the song, I like having it all, which is quite interesting because that was originally written by Elvis Costello, apparently. He wrote a song and they didn't quite like it, so they wrote somebody else in. Was it Lang and Winstanley? I think they roped in to rewrite it.
Okay.
So I think Elvis Costello had his nose put out of it. I think he even sang a little bit of it, his version of it, and it was quite similar.
The other potentially quite cool connection to the film is Paul Weller. And Paul Weller was a big fan of the book.
Yes.
And they did a song, didn't they, called Absolute Beginners?
Indeed.
Was it him?
Yeah,
or
the Jam, yeah.
Was it the Jam? He wasn't Star Council.
Yeah.
And then they do a reversioned... They changed the lyrics to a Star Council song and have Eddie O'Connell mime to it on the banks of the Thames.
A terrible idea.
Terrible.
Terrible idea, yeah. I mean, it's for me, that's probably the worst bit in the film. I'm a big Paul Weller fan, I have to say. I absolutely love him. And strangely, I was interviewing his sister. I was interviewing Paul Weller's sister quite a few years ago when they had the big Jam exhibition in Liverpool. And I confessed to her that I was a big Style Council fan, much more than a Jam fan, which is quite a thing to admit to. And she kind of half agreed. She said that from her side of the table, they had a whale of a time. The Style Council was a lot of fun, you know. They got to go to lots of exotic locations to shoot music videos and had lots of fun, you know, and camped it up a lot.
Yeah,
so
the Jam was on sort of council estates in outer London, wasn't it? And
oh, God, yeah. It's such a difference.
I mean, it is much more of a Style Council film than a Jam film. Absolutely.
Definitely. The coffee bars and the jazz and I suppose, just the whole kind of Soho being very cool and the fashions. But then the collaboration between the Style Council and the film is dreadful.
It's terrible, yeah. It's so badly judged having him miming to that song in that.
Begs the question why, doesn't it?
Even though Julian Temple was bigging the film up, he had already been removed from the film, hadn't he, at some point in production? What was all that
they
about?
wouldn't let him edit it, would they? I think he said there was 3 sets. Well, there was a team, and they'd split the film into 3 chunks, so they had different people working on the beginning, the middle, and the end of the film. And allegedly, which is really, I suppose, the shocking thing, is they chopped up the opening, you know, the continuous shot, which, like you said before, is probably the best thing about the film. Apparently, they chopped it all up and edited it.
Right, yeah, that would have been.
And fortunately, he was able to go back in and stick it back together again, you know, present it as it was meant to be.
Why was he removed?
He just really, really annoyed Goldcrest, apparently, and you know, they saw that this was an accident waiting to happen and wanted to try and salvage it, make it better, you know, make it a better film. From what I can gather, sort of reading interviews with him, I think a lot of the film is still in the state that, you know, it was left once they tampered with it. But I think he felt very, very sort of strongly about not messing up that opening sequence, you know. It must have been heartbreaking for him, mustn't it? You know, you can only imagine it's your baby, isn't it? It's your dream. And then I think they said to me he wasn't even allowed in the building. It's like, stay away. We're just going to fix it now. And that must be awful, I guess.
In a way, when I got my generous hat on, talking about the film, it feels like a really brave, radical attempt to do something exciting with the book and make it extremely contemporary. But when I get less generous, but I've got another hat that says less generous on the front, it feels like a sort of a coke-fueled 80s nightmare, you know, gaudy and hollow and just all surface.
Yeah, I mean, I do agree with you, I have to say. And, you know, I think when I wrote that article back in 2016, I think I must have been going through a bit of an absolute beginner's phase. Because looking back on it, I've watched it a few times over the last few years because I got it on Blu-ray and it looks amazing on Blu-ray, I have to say.
Visually, it is stunning, yeah.
Yeah, the colours are the colours are so vivid and, you know. But looking back today, I mean, I was spotting huge holes in it. Maybe because I'm sat watching it on a laptop very close up, you see the cracks a bit more, you know. I don't know, but there's, it is a mess. But it's a kind of mess that I enjoy, I suppose.
Often we say on this programme, lots of my guests are into quite bad films, and I've got a very high tolerance for crappy films.
Oh, same, yeah.
And I've watched some terrible films for this programme. And what I find is I watched them 2 or 3 times in the week or couple of weeks leading up to doing the recording, and I built a bit of affection for it. And I struggled with Absolute Beginners. And I think it's partly because because it is from my era. It's from my youth. This film. So it's not historically interesting. It's not like I'm looking at Soho in the 50s, like the real Soho in the real 50s.
Yeah.
It's just a bloated, I mean, it had a big budget, didn't it? And that 80s excess, that sort of Thatcherite kind of loads of money kind. It just has a touch of that to it.
It does. On the other hand, though,
yeah, I'm all about hearing your defence of it. That's what I'm here for.
It might be a very weak defence. I'm not sure. I remember being a teenager in the 80s, and we had 3 channels on the TV, and all of a sudden, Channel 4 came along, and it was very, very different, and it felt like, even though a lot of the stuff that was on there was very boring, there was a sense of ownership. It was like, this is our channel. This is, because you had stuff like Brookside and things like that you could really embrace. And then obviously they went into filmmaking, and we've still got Film 4. It was a real breath of fresh air in the 80s, because obviously the Tory government had put a bit of a halt on British filmmaking in the 80s. So you kind of relied on people like Channel 4, Palace Pictures, which of course is absolute beginners, and like Handmade Films, those kind of companies, to breathe that new life into cinema, because otherwise you were stuck with Gandhi and Chariots of Fire and all those kind of flag-waving films. So to me, I think Absolute Beginners fits into that whole kind of zeitgeist, if you like, that kind of Channel 4, Palace Pictures, that it was like something was happening, and it felt like it was happening for us, for teenagers or for young 20s or whatever. And it was a bit of a kick in the teeth for the government to be making these films as well. So I don't know, maybe that's the secret. Maybe that's why it kind of works for people from my age group now. And looking back, looking at it fresh, anybody watching it for the first time now would go, what the hell's that?
Yeah. Yeah, I know what you mean.
I guess it's, even though it's set in the 50s, it's still a kind of zeitgeist film,
Yeah. I know exactly what you mean about that Channel 4 thing. And I think the idea of giving it a go, trying something a little bit different.
Yeah.
If it had worked, it would have been a remarkable film.
Yeah.
And it just felt like if they've missed beats here and there, and
yes,
I think if they'd got better actors, maybe reined it back slightly.
Yeah.
I don't know. I mean, I know what you mean about that. It was a period where you could try things, and I do think it's a failure, but I think it's a noble failure as well. I think he gave it a go and it didn't work.
Yeah, I mean, I'm glad that he did. It's I'd rather it existed in the form that it's in than not exist at all, I guess.
In your article, you say that the book has not been made into a proper film yet.
No.
And I mean, that would be a great film. If somebody took Absolute Beginners and made a non-musical, I don't know, how would you do it? I imagine it in black and white for a start.
I wonder if it would be more suited now. And I was, in the last few years since that article was written, we've seen things like there was what was the BBC drama with Hugh Grant, where he played, was it Lord Lucan?
Oh, Jeremy Thorpe.
Jeremy Thorpe, sorry, of course, which was very atmospheric and similar era. And there was also a year or so ago, there was the other BBC drama about the Profumo affair, wasn't it? Which was done very well. BBC seem to be doing these kind of 50s and 60s period dramas incredibly well, don't they? So you wonder whether it would be better set as maybe a little 3-part drama or something,
Yeah, possibly. I think one of the things he didn't quite get right was he was attempting to express that slight surreal, it's almost written in a kind of blank verse, puts you slightly to one side of the drama.
Yeah.
And none of the characters have actual names in the book. They're all called things like Call Me Cobber and The Last Debutante from the Ball and all these kind of weird names that are like almost like sentences.
Uh-huh.
That's all difficult to reflect. And I think he was trying to express that in the film by making it slightly surreal. So I think if you did do a BBC drama, like you say, in that sort of Jeremy Thorpe, Profumo style, you'd have to sort of rein it back in a little bit.
It would take a brave attempt, wouldn't it, to make it right, I think.
Yeah.
Because it's in fairness, it is very niche, isn't it? It's still something of a cult book, isn't it? It's not a recognised classic, is it? So, it's always going to have a kind of niche audience and also probably an audience that are put off by the reputation of the film as well.
Yeah. We keep talking about the film having bombed and been a critical disaster, etc.
Yeah.
But only in this country, as far as I can gather. It was quite popular in other parts of the world, particularly Martin Scorsese was a fan, Michael Jackson was a fan. I mean, what do you put that down to?
I would very much put it down to the same reason why Benny Hill was massive in America. I think it's that British quirkiness, isn't it?
Okay.
I think we're still portrayed, aren't we? Very much still portrayed in Hollywood as being quite eccentric, the British, aren't we?
Yeah, the eccentric and also a sort of sophistication as well. Because I think you could see it's quite a sophisticated film. So I wonder if it's to do, like you say, it's to do with the portrayal of, or the perception of the UK abroad. But Martin Scorsese is quite a worldly, cine literate guy, extremely, of course, and knows the UK well. He's a big fan of Michael Powell.
Yes.
It seems odd that he's such a big fan, but apparently he is, which I find very strange. Is it British snobbery that we don't like it? I mean, maybe we're the ones that are wrong. We as in the British public.
I mean, are we just embarrassed of it, maybe, Because there are, even for somebody who, professes to be a fan of the film, there's certain moments where you cringe, isn't there?
Absolutely.
Like the bit with the kid, the baby boom, the little kid who Lionel Blair kind of takes under his wing. When that song comes on the album, you just want to kind of scratch it away, It's awful. The worst bit for me in that respect is where Smiley Culture comes on at the end and does a little rap. You've just been watching these kind of race riots and all this kind of 1958 stuff, and all of a sudden it's the 80s. There's Smiley Culture and he's singing, and he references the film as well. He even references Absolute Beginners. And
breaking down the fourth wall. Look at us. We've been very radical with our filmmaking.
It's exactly that, yeah. That's exactly what it is. But it doesn't. It just doesn't work, does it?
No, so much of it is misjudged like that. I just want to finish off by... I am going to quote you back a bit of your article now.
Go on.
It says, the film stands as either a disaster, an above-average piece of entertainment, or a cult classic, depending on your perspective.
Well, I'm going to quote somebody else now. Julian Temple read my article.
Oh, did he?
He did. He actually said, one-word response, both. Was it a disaster or was it a success or whatever? And he came back with both. So that was quite nice. But you're not interviewing Julian Temple. So my answer would be, pretty much what I said before. I'm glad it exists. I think it's something you can look at. You can see its faults. It's certainly not a perfect film. It's certainly not a perfect adaptation of the book. But it's got worth, For whatever reason, I think it's got worth. Maybe more than anything reflects the state of the film industry at the time, the British film industry at the time it was made. And it's a reaction, perhaps, to stuff like Chariots of Fire and Gandhi. And maybe also a reaction to the more kind of low-budget, mega-serious films of the era as well.
If you'd like to read Dell's original article about Absolute Beginners, you'll find a link to it in the show notes for this episode, along with other bits and pieces about the film, including a short interview with Julian Temple, who talks about the catastrophic effect the film had on his life. He's okay now, though. Thanks to Del Pike for coming on the show, and thanks again to Aiden McManus, and thanks to you, the lovely listener, for putting those earbuds in your lugholes to listen to this load of old waffle. If you've enjoyed the programme, I'd be very grateful if you could leave a nice review and /or star rating. It's very easy. All you have to do is go to ratethispodcast.com/SohoBytes and follow the simple instructions. That's ratethispodcast.com/SohoBytes. And please feel free to get in touch with the show with your comments and suggestions via Twitter. We're on @BytesSoho or by email on sohobytespodcast@gmail.com. And of course, all of these links, all the info about the guests, all the stuff and nonsense about every episode we've ever done, it's all on the show notes, which, as you know, is sohobytespodcast.com. Soho Bytes produced by me, Damdalagi, and is based on an original idea by Dr. Jing and Young. That's all from me. Until next time, bye for now.